You're listening to the Future Tech Podcast with Richard Jacobs. Future technologies such as artificial intelligence, stem cells, 3D printing, gene editing, Bitcoin, blockchain, the microbiome, quantum computing, virtual reality, and exploring space are much closer than you might think. In fact, many early versions of these technologies are in play right now, and the companies that are using these technologies are the focus of this podcast. My goal for you, the listener, is to learn from these podcasts. You may very well learn something that may change the course of your life for the better, steer you towards a new career, or give you insight into addressing a thorny medical problem. Remember, this podcast and its content is informational in nature only. No medical, tax, legal, financial, or psychological advice is being given. If you enjoyed the podcast, please listen, subscribe, like, and tell your friends about it. Thank you. Hello, this is Richard Jacobs with the Future Tech Podcast. I have Canon Brya. He's the CFO of Terrestrial Energy. The website is terrestrialenergy.com. So, Canon, thanks for coming. How you doing?
Greetings. Thank you.
Yeah. So tell me about Terrestrial. What's the premise of the company? What are you guys working on?
Yeah. So the objective of the company is to commercialize advanced nuclear technology that is the lowest cost, lowest emission, small, scalable, high temperature power systems for industrial use. These ingredients, low cost, low emission, small, scalable, and high temperature, allow a power system to reach beyond electricity and to provide power for industry, heating, and even the transport industry, the power needs of the transport industry. So the fundamental goal of the company is to become the world's killer app of energy, which is today is natural gas. So the way you do that is by delivering a power system which is cheaper, cleaner, and more convenient and more versatile.
Yeah, I mean, nuclear energy, again, unfortunately, it has a difficult history. You know, there's been accidents, there's been problems, and I'm sure no one likes to talk about it, but how different is the nuclear energy production today, you know, versus 30 years ago, 40 years ago?
Well, the technology which is operating today is pretty much unchanged since the dawn of the atomic age. And despite all of the doom and gloom reports and accidents and things that you see, they absolutely just pale in comparison to other industries. The nuclear power industry is tremendously effective in delivering clean power, and it has been for 63 years. The new technologies, nuclear innovation, nevertheless improves on that in a stepwise fashion. So the new technologies which are being developed today by companies like mine generally have the goal of solving the market problem, which is that nuclear power has been a great stable source of electric power for many decades, but it has a really high upfront construction cost, and they generally build them way too big, so big, in fact, that even national economies can't afford to take the risk to build them. So we have to build them smaller, and we have to build them cheaper. And that's what nuclear innovation is all about. It's about delivering power which is low cost, in fact, the lowest cost source of power in the world, cheaper than natural gas, and building these power plants at a size and scale that is a lot more versatile for different uses, including smaller markets, and industrial processes, industrial applications, and even in the transport sector. And I can explain that a little later.
Well, what does that mean the plants are too big? Like, how big is an average coal plant? Are you talking about the energy output? Or are you talking about literally the physical size of a plant?
Well, the physical sizes of the plants are generally pretty small relative to the power output that they have. I was referring more to the actual power output. So nuclear power plants are almost always built at a massive scale, 1,000 megawatts or more. That's how they build them today, and they do that so that they can benefit from economies of scale. But the only problem is the market for those types of huge systems is very limited, and one of the main reasons is because the sticker price is huge. When you build a giant plant, you have generally associated with a giant cost giant construction costs, and that's one of the big problems that nuclear power faces. Now, when you build a giant power plant and you operate it for 60 or 80 years, and then you have a low operating cost over that time period, the life cycle costs end up being cost competitive. But that doesn't negate the fact that you have a huge upfront cost, which most market players are just not going to be able to accept. They're not going to take that risk.
You mean, so if we built a 100 megawatt plant instead of a 1,000 megawatt plant, it would be a lot cheaper and maybe easier to swallow for a country's government?
Precisely. And the idea behind nuclear innovation is not to just take the existing technology and make it smaller. Okay, yes, some companies are doing that, and that could prove to be a successful strategy in and of itself. But what real nuclear innovation is all about is making plants which are smaller, scalable, so you can scale them up and down a bit depending on the industry need, but to also make them cheaper on a per unit of energy basis, right? So it has to be cheaper per kilowatt hour than natural gas power. And so besides being smaller, it's also it's also cheaper. So you're getting a double economic effect on your bottom line upfront costs.
So, what's the average size of power plants in the U.S. or in other countries right now? How big are they? Like coal powered or other power? What size do they run at?
Yeah, so that's one big benefit that fossil fuel plants have over almost everything else, is that they are totally scalable. You can build a fossil fuel plant at any size, and the per unit of energy costs will, over the life cycle of the plant, will almost always end up being the same. So you can build them, 20 megawatts. So you can build them at 4 megawatts. You can build them at 1,000 megawatts, and they'll almost always work out to be economically about the same. Nuclear power doesn't have that capability today. That's why we have to birth it into the world of industry. So it's the only way you're going to be able to compete with fossil fuels, right? Because fossil fuels has that convenience. And if you want to be better than fossil fuels, then you have to be at least that convenient or more convenient. And that's the point of being the killer app of energy. You want to be cheaper, cleaner, more convenient, more versatile. That is one of the key ingredients. Temperature is the other one. So fossil fuels can achieve almost any temperature that you need for industry. And again, nuclear power can't do that. It can't achieve that, not in its current form.
Yeah, what you mean is because it's dangerous to operate a nuclear power plant in the higher temperature ranges, or what's the constraint on temperature?
It's because of the formulation of nuclear power plants. The way nuclear power plants were designed back in the 1950s were fundamentally for a nuclear submarine application. So those designs are solid fuel and water cooled, and that is the design that we've been stuck with. Society has been stuck with this design. I mean, it's worked tremendously well, but it's not particularly versatile, and it's not useful in industry. And the main reason may be obvious when you consider what the coolant is. Water as a coolant is not effective for anything other than, or hardly anything other than, making electricity. And it's not even particularly good for making electricity, right? Because it has a boiling point of 100 degrees C. Now, if you want to provide power for industry, like if you want to make steel, for example, you need temperatures above 1,500 degrees C. A water-cooled system is simply not going to be able to provide that. Only fossil fuels can do that.
You either need like a tremendous flow rate so the water doesn't, all boil away before it cools stuff, or you need something else, like I guess molten salts and these other kind of new coolants out there. Can you talk about this?
That's right. That there is no level of water flow that could possibly answer that heat duty. So what you need is new coolants, innovation in the fundamental formulation of nuclear power. The actual rudiments of the design have to completely change. So in our system, which is a high temperature system, the fuel is a liquid fuel, right? Liquid uranium, and the coolant is a molten salt. In fact, the fuel is a molten salt as well. And when you have this formulation, you have a system where the fuel / coolant, they are one and the same, have a boiling point above 1400 degrees C, and a system which operates naturally at 700 degrees C. That's the equilibrium temperature. So the temperature ranges that you can address in a system like that are obviously far, far greater than conventional nuclear.
So wouldn't this even be retrofittable possibly to existing, 1,000 megawatt plants that in the past only could produce electricity, but maybe now could produce, 3 or 4 different kinds of power sources, making it more versatile, more sensitive to market price changes, and more efficient, and maybe better off using existing infrastructure? Is that possible?
No, I don't think so. The designs are so fundamentally different that, when you have an existing nuclear power plant, it's regulated for a very specific design. When you start changing any tiny little ingredient of that, basically the whole plant has to be totally relicensed. So that's a non-starter. That's not even that's a complete non sequitur, basically, in our industry. And it has to do with the regulation. So from a physical standpoint, okay, maybe there might be some way of doing it, but regulatorily, no way, not in a million years. When you design a new system, every single element from the ground up has to be licensed. So we have a system which is specifically geared to use these fuels and these coolants and to operate at high temperature. So and there are other innovations that are built into the design as well. All of these have to be licensed as a unit, as a whole. That's the only way it will work. I tell you what can be retrofitted though, because the balance of plant infrastructure, that is the gear that's used to convert heat into electricity, called balance of plant in industry terms. All of that infrastructure is virtually the same for our system and most any other power system, like, for example, a coal plant or a natural gas plant. Ironically, not a conventional nuclear power plant, but for most any other system, you can, for example, take an aging coal plant, swap out the furnace, the coal furnace, and swap in one of our nuclear reactor systems. You can take the heat from that system and drive it into the balance of plant, which is already there, and make electricity. So that is a possibility. Yeah, that can be done.
So, I know obviously everything in a nuclear plant has to be licensed, like you said, from the ground up, each step. It just seems like there's such huge hurdles. No one, I would guess, would want a nuclear power plant near them, probably because of irrational fears or maybe well-founded fears. I don't know, that something could go wrong, even though the technology is better. So it seems like, I don't know, it seems problematic to try to build a whole bunch of small ones, because each time you have to go through all the regulations, all the town hall meetings or whatever it would be. So I would think that would drive you towards only doing massive ones, because you're kind of got to put all your eggs in a gigantic basket in order to get a project done that would be significant.
I just don't think that's a factor. The industry builds industrial facilities. They build them without regard or without the highest regard for how it's going to impact the community. Industry builds industrial facilities with every regard for economics. And if industry was really concerned about safety, there would be no such thing as coal plants today, because coal plants spew out billions of tons of garbage every year, and people breathe it in and get pulmonary disease and die. The nuclear power does not do that. And if safety and pollution and these types of issues were really the defining decision-making characteristic of industry, there would simply be no coal plants. And the fact of society is that coal plants are not being ripped down. They are in the West to a degree, but mostly in most parts of the world, they're being built new ones all the time, every day. And the reason is because of economics. They are cheap. They're cheap to build, and they're cheap to operate. And if people get lung disease and die, oh well, industry doesn't care, right? It's not their problem because they've externalized those costs. And so I think people have a view of the reality of how industrial projects come into being, and that view is not is it doesn't really comport with reality in my observation.
Well, that's why I asked you, because I wanted to know what the reality is of, nuclear power versus just, what I've heard as a layperson. So I'm glad you're telling me and stuff. So, okay, makes sense.
Nuclear innovation is tremendously safe. It's as safe, if not more safe, than conventional nuclear. And conventional nuclear is most definitively, without question, the safest form of energy which has ever existed.
Any stats you could put out?
Sure.
I don't know how you characterize it, but yeah, tell me some stats to give it specific numbers.
Sure, absolutely. So safety and risk are absolutely defined by the number of people that have been hurt on a per unit of production. So this is any industrial industrial facility of any kind, or any industry, or however you want to look at it. And the fact is, in 63 years of round-the-clock emission-free power, the nuclear power industry has killed or injured around 100 people. Not 100 people a year, but 100 grand total. In
the U.S. or worldwide?
No, worldwide. The vast majority of those, in fact, I think I can safely say all of those, are from one industrial accident, which occurred in the USSR in the 80s. But what the propaganda is, but if you choose to go and read the credible studies, and there have been decades and decades of studies which have been done on this by the United Nations and the World Health Organization, and the data is absolutely clear. No one's been hurt. There's been 100 people that were killed. That were, of course, that's tragic, and we don't belittle that. But the coal industry kills 100 people every 5 minutes, and they've been doing it for hundreds of years, and they will continue to do so forevermore until coal finally goes away forever. So, if you're talking about safety and you're talking about risk, the data is absolutely unquestionable. There is no question. But people don't act. Unfortunately, people don't act and make decisions based on data, and they don't choose what to be afraid of or not be afraid of based on data. That's not the way human emotions work. So, but fortunately, we have generally in the world we have a system of making decisions like this that are based on data. So, which is why we've advanced as far as we have technologically as a species. So this will only continue to get more logical and more sensible. And I mean, nuclear innovation is sort of, in my view, the ultimate expression of this, because you now finally have an energy solution that can deliver cheap, clean power to billions of people that need it, and you can provide power for industry, for primary manufacturing, for all the industrial things that we enjoy in modern society, can all be powered by nuclear innovation. And even transport. I brought this up a little earlier. When you have a high temperature system that's small and clean and low cost, it means that you can make clean hydrogen, because that's what you need to make clean hydrogen. You can separate hydrogen from water. It means you can make industrial carbon. It takes a lot of power, but if you have a low cost, clean, high temperature system, you can make industrial carbon. And it means that you can take that industrial hydrogen and you can take that industrial carbon and you can power a chemical process that converts them into gasoline. And what you end up with is a transport fuel, which would go into your car or into a civilian aircraft or into an ocean-going ship or a train, and there will be no petroleum and no combustion anywhere in the fuel cycle or in the fuel supply chain of the creation of that fuel. And only nuclear innovation can offer this. There is no other solution anywhere that can do this.
Until it's burned at the end of the tailpipe or at the end of the end of its life, but at least along the way, it's not. There's no combustion.
But the carbon has come from that carbon, which is being combusted in your engine, has come out of the atmosphere in the first place. So we call that carbon negative transport fuels, because they not only sucking carbon out of the air to make your fuels, you're also avoiding all sorts of carbon intensive processes related to the production of fuel, like extractive activities, shipping,
Right.
like for example, shipping oil from Libya to North America, or shipping LNG from Australia to China or whatever it may be, and refining. You can take the intensive emissions from petrochemical refining out of the equation as well. So we call that carbon negative because all of those activities are avoided.
Interesting. So, do you think nuclear still has, in the public perception, do you think it has a bad rap, or is that just my perception? I mean, what do you think? And I want to ask you a question based on that, if you think it is or not.
Well, if you ask a very basic question, such as, do you think we need nuclear power? The opinion will be negative. But if you start sort of framing the question differently, and by the way, I'm basing this on actual opinion surveys which have been taken. If you frame the question in a way for example, telling people that nuclear has the same emissions as wind and hydro, and based on that information, do you think nuclear power is necessary as part of a clean energy portfolio? The numbers start to go up. So, and if you start asking people if you frame the question, do you think we need innovative nuclear designs to help power a clean energy system? Again, the numbers go up. So it all depends on how you ask the question. There's no doubt that the instant reaction to the instinctive response to nuclear is a negative one. But again, there's a lot in there that's not been unpacked for people. And furthermore, societies, again, I go back to what I said about industry. Societies don't really have the power to make industrial decisions. Only industry does. And industry makes decisions based on economic data. So if industry sees a solution which is economically superior than the current solution, then they will make the substitution. That is an economic certainty. So,
right.
I mean, unfortunately, democracy, it doesn't really work in industry. Ultimately, it could lead to some very good decisions.
So I would guess that nuclear has to try harder, I guess, to make its presence known and to get out there more than other industries, even though maybe it shouldn't.
I don't think so necessarily. The way that nuclear is going to be successful in the future is by innovation. There hasn't been a lot of innovation in the nuclear power industry in 60 years.
Well, let's talk about the innovation that has happened. Like you mentioned molten salts instead of water for cooling. So what that says to me is there's less likelihood maybe of a runaway reaction because the cooling elements now use molten salts won't vaporize nearly at the same temperature that water would. So maybe that would add to the safety. I don't know if that's true or not, but can you talk about a few of the innovations in nuclear that you think are fantastic, either for efficiency or safety or whatever it may be?
Yes. So the nuclear innovation is of this character is relatively new in this industry, and innovative designs have not yet come to fruition. They're still in the process of coming to market, and they will be in this process of coming to market over the next few years. So it's definitely it's a very positive development, but it doesn't characterize the current paradigm for nuclear power. It characterizes a future paradigm a few years in the future. So I just wanted to make that part clear. But the innovations, I mean, the most important one for us as a company, for example, is economic innovation. But economic innovation doesn't magically appear. It comes from safety innovation, waste innovation, proliferation innovation. All of these aspects of nuclear power. If you make them better, the cost will go down. The cost of construction, the cost of regulation, because when you make a better system, which improves upon all these things, it translates into economic innovation. So we have a lot of in our design, for example, we have a lot of these innovations, and those are the things that drive economic innovation. We don't talk about those things because, well, conventional nuclear power is already very safe, and it already has an excellent waste profile, even though everybody thinks the opposite. It has an excellent non-proliferation profile, even though everybody thinks the opposite. and it has an excellent emissions profile, even though everybody thinks the opposite. All we care about is the facts. So to develop a system which improves upon the safety, which is already the highest level of safety that exists anywhere, is kind of foolish. Why would you try to improve on something which is already far, far, far and away the best? It doesn't make any sense. It's not solving a problem. The problem that really exists is that nuclear power plants are too big and too expensive to build.
How expensive are they to build at the 1,000 megawatt level on average versus a smaller amount?
Well, there's a range, quite a range actually. So the plants which are being built in China, for example, extremely efficiently with huge government support, can be built at under $3 a watt. And that's pretty cheap. In the OECD, where they're building large new plants, that they can range anywhere from 8 to up to even, we're seeing $20 a watt. I mean, that is that's a huge range. And again, a lot of the ones that are being built in the OECD are at the upper end of that range. So that is not competitive. You can't build a power plant which costs 10, 15, 20 billion dollars to build. That's crazy. No private sector concern will ever assume that level of risk. Small economies can't assume that level of risk. And now it's proving out that even large economies won't bear that level of risk. The UK just recently backed out of two construction projects, two new nuclear power stations in the UK, and they got out of it. They backed out because the risk is simply too huge. So there's a very, very limited set of actors, industrial actors, that are willing to take on this level of risk. China's one of them. And again, one of the big reasons why is because they've developed the ability to build them a lot cheaper than they do in the West. Russia is another, and Korea is another. And they can build these plants and assume that that risk on a national level using a federal balance sheet to support it. But that's it. They're the only ones.
What about the U.S.?
No, the U.S. won't do it. There are two reactors being built in the U.S. today. They're billions over budget and years, even decades behind schedule. And they were about somewhere between 50 and 20 new construction licenses just prior to Fukushima, so in the sort of the 2000s period. And none of those have been followed through on. None of those have been carried forward. And the reason is because, well, the U.S. government, they don't fund power plants. That's not a government function. Yes, there are some state-owned utility companies, but I mean, generally speaking, the U.S. government doesn't get involved in that, and the U.S. private sector won't fund. They won't take that level of risk.
So, what do you see as the 5 or 10 year future of nuclear?
Well, it looks tremendously bright from where I'm sitting. I see nuclear innovation today basically at the same place where the PC market was, like in the mid to late 70s. It's a power system which answers elegantly and sort of almost simplistically all the demands of the global power sector. Right? The global power sector desperately needs power, a lot of power, more power than most people can imagine. They need it to be clean. So not fossil fuels, right? Can't be fossil fuels. They needed to be cheap. So generally speaking, not solar and wind, because their life cycle costs, when you add everything in, are not that competitive with fossil fuels. And they need a lot of power, and they need it fast. So it has to be deployable rapidly on a grand scale. And nuclear power, even the old style of nuclear power, has proven that it can rapidly deploy and massively decarbonize a national energy system. It's been proven in France and Sweden and Ontario and even in the USA in the 60s and 70s. Dozens of plants were built, and those plants are still standing. And guess what? They're delivering 64% of America's carbon-free power even today. Wow. That's quite an achievement. And a lot of that deployment was done in a very short space of time. So nuclear innovation ticks all of these boxes in one fell swoop, which is why I think it's going to become one of the most important investment classes in the world, and will become a major energy solution to substitute for fossil fuels. And again, not just in electricity, but also industry and transport and heating. And it will deliver affordable power to billions of people that don't have it today. And that's a major market need, and that's a major societal need, right? People that don't have power suffer from a form of sadism. It's not the way society should be. When you deliver power, it's proven time and time again. The data overwhelmingly shows that when people gain access to energy, their standard of living improves, right? GDP goes up, and this is how we improve societies, by delivering energy. That's the fundamental ingredient. And we're not the only one that thinks this, by the way. Bill Gates has been very vocal about his belief system that delivering cheap, clean power around the world is his greatest wish, more than anything else, technologically speaking. Right. So it's the future is tremendously bright for nuclear innovation. It's a very good place to be. Very exciting.
Well, very good. So what's the best way for people to learn more, to get in contact, ask questions, etc.?
Yeah, we have our website, which has updates. You can sign up for the email distribution list. Maybe even better than that is our social media channels. So we're on, all the usual suspects, Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, and so on. And we also have a blog. It's called The Fourth Generation. And I would urge your listeners to sign up for the email distribution list for the blog, and also onto the social media channels. Fourth Generation blog. We're on all the usuals: Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, YouTube, Instagram, and so on.
Yeah, Canon, I appreciate you coming on the podcast. Thanks for being here.
Yeah, it's my pleasure. Thanks very much for having me.
You're listening to the Future Tech Podcast with Richard Jacobs. Future technologies such as artificial intelligence, stem cells, 3D printing, gene editing, Bitcoin, blockchain, the microbiome, quantum computing, virtual reality, and exploring space are much closer than you might think. In fact, many early versions of these technologies are in play right now, and the companies that are using these technologies are the focus of this podcast. My goal for you, the listener, is to learn from these podcasts. You may very well learn something that may change the course of your life for the better, steer you towards a new career, or give you insight into addressing a thorny medical problem. Remember, this podcast and its content is informational in nature only. No medical, tax, legal, financial, or psychological advice is being given. If you enjoyed the podcast, please listen, subscribe, like, and tell your friends about it. Thank you.